Algeria International. It's time for the news.
Algeria has strongly condemned the terrorist attack targeting the headquarters of the Turkish Interior Ministry in Ankara, expressing her full solidarity with Turkey. And the Algerian delegate to Vienna, Larbi Latrache, has reiterated Algeria's main principles on disarmament and non-proliferation issues. The UN mission has arrived in Karabakh mainly to assess humanitarian needs. And in the U.S., the Senate has passed a last-minute spending bill averting government shutdown that would have had a disastrous impact on the American public and economy. And those were the major developments. Now, the full news edition. Good afternoon. The President of the Republic today chaired a meeting of the Council of Ministers here in Algiers. More details will be broadcast in the upcoming news editions. And Algeria has strongly condemned the terrorist attack targeting the headquarters of the Turkish Interior Ministry in Ankara, expressing her full solidarity with Turkey. 2 police officers have been injured in a suicide bombing attack in front of the Interior Ministry in the Turkish capital, Ankara. Their wounds are not life-threatening. Turkey's Interior Minister has said in a post on social media that 2 attackers were responsible for the explosion. Both attackers are dead. One detonated himself while the other was killed. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has condemned the attack in the Turkish capital and expressed solidarity with the country. A number of other countries like Palestine and Saudi Arabia have also condemned the attack. Meanwhile, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has spoken during the first session of the Turkish parliament after an absence of almost 3 months. The address comes hours after the attack on the Interior Ministry located very close to the parliament building. The president of the National Council for Human Rights, Abdelmajid Zalani, has received the vice president of the Saudi Human Rights Commission, Hisham al-Sheikh, and the delegation accompanying him. On this occasion, Mr. Zalani indicated that this meeting comes in the framework of cooperation between the 2 human rights bodies, stressing that the 2 parties have carried out an exchange of views on a number of issues related to human rights. Still with national news, and the Algeria-Uganda Business Council held its first session after being installed yesterday, Saturday, in Kampala, Uganda. Here is more with Jamal Salmani.
The installation of this council took place on the sidelines of the Algeria-Uganda Trade and Investment Forum under the motto Opportunities of the African Continental Free Trade Area for Strengthening Bilateral Trade Relations between Algeria and Uganda. 51 Algerian companies as well as businessmen from both countries took part in the Algeria-Uganda Trade and Investment Forum. The installation of the Algeria-Uganda Business Council came following the partnership and cooperation agreement signed on Friday between the Algerian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and its Ugandan counterpart. In a statement on the sidelines of the economic event, the person in charge of management of the Algerian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Hossein Zawi, affirmed that the Joint Business Council constitutes a mechanism that strengthens economic cooperation between the 2 countries, highlighting the promise and opportunities offered to both parties. For his part, the president of the Algerian Economic Renewal Council, Kamel Mullah, hailed the creation of the Algerian-Uganda Business Council and the organization of the forum, which constitutes an important step aimed at strengthening South-South cooperation. The permanent secretary of the Ugandan Ministry of Commerce, Industry and Cooperation, Geraldine Sali, affirmed that the creation of the Bilateral Business Council represents a new impetus for cooperation between Algerian and Ugandan businessmen. For her part, the president of Uganda's Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Olive Kikongo, highlighted the importance of the creation of a common business council and the organization of the Algeria-Uganda Forum to boost investment and bilateral trade.
The Algerian delegate to Vienna, Larbi Latrache, has reiterated the main principles of Algeria on disarmament and non-proliferation issues. During the general debate of the 67th session of the General Conference of the Atomic Energy International Agency held in Vienna, the Algerian diplomat affirmed that Algeria draws these positions from its commitment to the international treaty on this issue, as well as her suffering to this day from the effects of French nuclear tests in the the Algerian Sahara. Mr. Latouche deplored the insufficient progress in terms of ridding the world of nuclear and mass destruction weapons after repeated failures of the conference to examine the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The head of the Algerian delegation hailed the holding of the third session of the conference on the creation of a weapon-free zone in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the Algerian diplomat stressed the importance of the use of nuclear technology in several sectors.
Algeria insists on the importance of further strengthening the use of nuclear technology in the sectors of health, agriculture, water resources, environment, and others. Algeria is also committed to the African Regional Cooperation Programme for research, development, and training in the field of nuclear research in science and technology.
Let's know that the Algerian delegate to Vienna, Larbi Latouche, took part in the general debate of the 67th session of the General Conference of the Atomic Energy International Agency in Vienna. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Lesotho, Samuel Matekane, on a visit to South Africa, reiterated in a joint statement their country's firm support for the Sahrawi and Palestinian causes. And the Polisario Front has reaffirmed that its legal proceedings before the Court of Justice of the European Union to put an end to the illegal exploitation of Western Sahara's natural resources by Morocco lies on the solid foundations of the 2016 ruling of the court that said that Western Sahara and Morocco were two distinct and separate territories. More details with Jamal Salmani.
The Polisario Front made these comments in a press release following the notification by the Court of Justice of the European Union of the hearing date set for the 24th and 25th of October for the two appeals brought by the European Commission and the Council against the judgments of the Court, which at the request of the Front annulled the new EU-Morocco Fisheries Agreement and the agreement on tariff preferences that illegally included the occupied Sahrawi territory. The Sahrawi official in charge of the legal case, Obi Bouchraya Bashir, stated in the press release that our line is to start from the excellent foundations of the 2016 judgment and to extend its scope in order to eradicate this dishonest game of the extension agreements concluded against the will of the Sahrawi people. The Sahrawi official also pointed out that the decisions of the European Court of Justice in 2016 and 2018, the decision of the European Court in 2021, and the historic decision of the African Court of Human and People's Rights affirm the permanent sovereignty of the Sahrawi people over the region and its natural resources, their inalienable right to self-determination and independence, and the need to consult them through their sole legitimate representative, the Polisario Front.
And the UN mission arrived in Karabakh today morning mainly to assess humanitarian needs. It marks the first time in about 30 years that the international body has gained access to the region. UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said earlier that the UN team will seek to assess the situation on the ground and identify the humanitarian needs for both people remaining and the people that are on the move. And in the U.S., the Senate passed a last-minute spending bill Saturday night, averting a government shutdown that would have triggered a calamitous domino effect on the American public and economy. The details with Jamal Salmani.
The Senate voted to pass the continuing resolution 3 hours before a midnight shutdown of the federal government would have taken effect. The measure was signed into law by President Joe Biden late Saturday night. The bill allows the government to stay open for 45 days, giving the House and Senate more time to finish their funding legislation. The House voted 335 to 91 to pass the stopgap spending measure. The House will resume its work on Monday. The 71-page short-term bill crafted by House Speaker Kevin McCarthy allows disaster relief funds but does not include new financial assistance for Ukraine's ongoing conflict with Russia. Speaking to Newsman, Mr. McCarthy said,
Just moments ago on the House floor, we passed by overwhelming numbers the ability to keep government open for the next 6 weeks. We've got to understand why we are here. The Senate has produced not one appropriation bill through the floor. The House, more than 70% of discretionary spending has now passed. I do not believe our troops need to be punished for us not getting the work done. So I ask Congress, we'll stay in session the next 2 weeks, continue to work to get this done, but you cannot look the men and women in our military in the eye and ask them why they are not going to be able to pay their bills because the Senate hasn't done their work.
Since the start of the conflict, the U.S. has unleashed a war chest worth more than $43 billion in security assistance for Kiev. Speaking at the Senate, Majority Leader expressed concern over funding for Ukraine.
We will not stop fighting for more economic and security assistance for Ukraine. Majorities in both parties support Ukraine aid, and doing more is vital for America's security and for democracy around the world.
For his part, U.S. President Joe Biden said in a statement after the bill passed out of the Senate that was good news for the American people, adding that the U.S. should never have been in this position in the first place. Meanwhile, Speaker Kevin McCarthy promised punishment for New York Democrat Jamal Bowman on Saturday and called his alleged tactic to delay a House vote by pulling an office building fire alarm a new law.
I was really appalled of watching Democrats' actions today, to delay it, to get to a shutdown. But when we found that an individual elected to Congress would pull a fire alarm, that's a new low. We watched how people have been treated if they've done something wrong in this Capitol. It'll be interesting to see how he is treated on what he was trying to obstruct when it came to the American public. I'm going to have a discussion with the Democratic leader about it. But this should not go without punishment. This is an embarrassment. You're elected to be a member of Congress.
Bowman pulled the fire alarm as Democrats were reviewing the text of a surprise continuing resolution that has just been shared by Republicans.
14 hours 42 minutes Algiers time. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Palestine has directly held the Israeli government responsible for the recent incursions by Israeli settlers into Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied Jerusalem and the subsequent consequences on the conflict dynamics. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and time now for the headlines. Algeria has strongly condemned the terrorist attack targeting the headquarters of the Turkish Interior Ministry in Ankara, expressing her full solidarity with Turkey. And the Algerian delegate to Vienna, Larbi Latrache, has reiterated Algeria's main principles on disarmament and non-proliferation issues. A UN mission has arrived in Karabakh mainly to assess humanitarian needs. And in the U.S., the Senate has passed a last-minute spending bill averting a government shutdown that would have had a disastrous impact on the American public and economy. That's it for our news bulletin. I invite you now to listen to an interview conducted by Jamal Salmani with the Director of Government Affairs Department at the Council on American-Islamic Relations, Robert Macau, on the latest decision by France to ban women in her team wearing hijab to participate in the 2024 Olympic Games.
The United Nations Human Rights Office has criticized the French government for banning French athletes from wearing the hijab at the Paris Olympics next year. Spokeswoman for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Maria Hurtado, has said that no one should impose on a woman what she needs to wear or not wear. Hurtado's comments came after French sports minister said that French athletes will not be allowed to wear a hijab at the Paris Olympics next year, arguing in favor of a strict regime of secularism applied rigorously in the field of sport. This triggered a number of reactions, including the one of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, a Muslim civil rights and advocacy group, which sent a letter to the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on the matter. For more details, joining us today from Washington, the organization's Director of Government Affairs Department, Robert Macau. Mr. Macau, thank you so much for joining us on Radio Algeria International.
Thank you for having us.
First of all, what is your reaction to the latest move by the French government to ban women wearing the hijab from participating in the 2024 Olympics? And how might this decision be perceived in terms of international human rights standards?
Well, France's banning of French Muslim athletes wearing hijab in the 2024 Paris Olympics, it violates the very spirit of the Olympics, which is international inclusion, where we have athletes from across the world participating in sport. And to ban a class of women who wear hijab from their own country while inviting Muslim athletes from other countries to participate who will wear hijab, it violates the spirit of the Olympics, and it should be condemned. And here in the United States, we have passed a law called the International Religious Freedom Act, where we can designate other countries as countries of particular concern, countries that violate the religious freedom and international norms of religious rights. And so we're calling on the U.S. government to apply this designation to France. This has been a long, ongoing demand from CARE. They already banned the wearing of hijab in their schools. They have now banned the wearing of abaya by Muslim female students. And this is a long line of religious discrimination and targeting its Muslim religious minorities.
Mr. Macau, you have sent Mr. Blinken a letter. Could you give us details about the content of this letter?
Yes, absolutely. So we sent the letter on September 26th. We're strongly urging the U.S. State Department to first and foremost to publicly condemn France for both its decision for banning Muslim students from wearing abaya, but also for its ban on French citizens wearing hijab in the 2024 Olympics. We go on to characterize the many different religious rights violations that are found in France. We've seen that public employment, Muslims are less than half likely to receive a callback compared to Christians that have similar qualifications. At least 75 mosques in France are currently being surveilled by the government. Since 2020, about 30 mosques have been closed by the government. And there's just this pattern of discrimination. We also, if CARE is America's largest Muslim rights organization, France closed the largest French Muslim rights organization, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France. So this is a pattern not only in French civil society, but by the French government to discriminate against this Muslim populace. And that's why we believe it's time for the U.S. government to declare France a country of particular concern for its violations of religious freedom.
Right.
We also believe the UN should launch its own separate investigation, and the U.S. should support that.
Mr. Macau, regarding designating France as a country of particular concern, in the letter addressed to Mr. Blinken, the Council on American Islamic Relations called on the U.S. government to designate France as a country of particular concern. How could this be possible, and how could this be achieved?
Well, it's possible because when there's a political will, there's a political way. So right now, the U.S. treats France with a very special ally status. However, France is in violation of international norms and also by U.S. designations of what it means to violate religious freedom. So if there's a political will in this country, and CARE is a very political organization, we are going to use our advocacy as a grassroots organization to raise awareness and to continue to campaign. Now, we hope that we get a response from Secretary Blinken, but we also sent this letter to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and we also sent this to the U.S. Ambassador on International Religious Freedom. And so, we're targeting 3 separate parts of the State Department to engage on this, and we're hoping to build greater awareness about France being an Islamophobic country that needs to be designated as such. And when you designate a country as a country of particular concern, that opens up more avenues for how the U.S. is going to combat this type of Islamophobia, how it will better monitor these incidents, and how we as a country can strategically respond to encourage France to be a better country for all its citizens, including its 6 to 8 million Muslim residents.
Mr. Macau, just a question. Have you received an answer to your letter?
We haven't yet. Normally, it can take a month to 2 months to get a formal response back. We have reached out to the State Department about France and India and China and other countries. And so over the years, we have engaged with the U.S. State Department when it comes to issues of Islamophobia in other countries and how the U.S. government may respond.
Right, perfect. So do you think that we may witness a condemnation from the U.S. government about the ban in the Olympic Games?
I think it's going to be hard for the U.S. government to ignore this, especially as we usually have Muslim American female athletes that wear hijab and participate in the Olympics. Now, it's good to see that the United Nations has condemned this. It's good to see that the Olympic International Committee has said that their village, the right to wear hijab is to be protected. We know that Muslim athletes from other countries will continue to wear their hijabs in France, but it's a question of whether France will recognize the rights of its own citizens or even create the ability for Muslim athletes to compete at the highest level.
Mm-hmm. And what are the perspectives and reactions of the Muslim community, for example, in the U.S., regarding the ban on hijabs during the Olympic Games?
I think that CARE shared the sentiments of the Muslim community in that we find this to be abhorrent, that it contradicts these norms of democracy that our two countries have shared for several hundred years. France helped America during the American Revolution. America has defended France throughout the world wars. We are allies, and we're supposed to, as democracies, support this type of religious freedom to wear hijab, to express your faith. And when our allies aren't doing this, we have to remind them.
Mr. Macau, you spoke about other delegations participating in the Olympic Games coming from Muslim countries or coming from other countries that are non-Muslim, but the participating athletes are Muslim. So what potential impact might this ban have on the participation and representation of Muslim athletes in the 2024 Olympic Games?
It's a really good question. I think that the IOC has already made it clear that Muslim athletes from other countries should feel as though they can participate without having any censorship or ban on their religious headwear. It's more a question of what France will allow its own citizens to do. But again, if we get to the point where France really does ban Muslim athletes or creates these types of rules that would discourage Muslim athletes from participating, I would ask the OIC to reconsider France as a future contestant for the Olympics. And I wouldn't be surprised if several Muslim athletes showed displays of either civil disobedience or their own form of advocacy when they take the world center stage in France.
Mr. Macau, let's just recall that the United Nations spokesperson Marta Hurtado told reporters, I quote, "No one should dictate what a woman must or must not wear," end of quote. Mr. Macau, you called on the U.S. government to initiate a U.S.-backed United Nations investigation into France's recurrent breaches of fundamental religious freedoms. Could you tell us more?
Yes, just as, a member of the UN Security Council, which France is also a member, I know that becomes a very hard thing to request, but there are a number of human rights commissions and boards within the United Nations. There are offices that deal with religious liberty, and sometimes we are at odds with our fellow members on the UN Security Council. It's known for a fact that the U.S. does not always see eye to eye with China or Russia. And so we're encouraging the U.S. to, within the UN and its governing bodies, to support greater clarity in investigations into France's religious freedom violations, especially against its Muslim citizens.
Let's just say that in June, France's Council of State upheld a ban on women footballers wearing the hijab. As you know, sports is not the only field which is targeted, right? I also recall that France's education minister announced the ban of the abaya ahead of the resumption of classes in the country, and your organization condemned the French government's initial decision to ban Muslim students from wearing the abaya.
CARE actually has a standing advisory for American Muslims not to travel to France. We believe that France's discrimination against Muslim citizens and also Muslim travelers to a degree creates a very unsafe environment for Muslims to live in or even travel to France. As you just said, the hijab had already been banned in public schools. Now they're banning abaya, which is just basically a robe that women can wear, which is a very modest dress. So I really can't understand as to why the French government is doing this, except that they are Islamophobic.
Mr. Macau, these bans are typically supported by the right and far-right political factions, despite opposition from the left, which argues that they infringe upon individuals' religious freedoms and civil liberties. How does this time, in particular, how does this ban fit into the broader discussion of secularism and multiculturalism in France, and what implications might it have for the future of religious freedoms in the country?
Well, just taking a step back, in America, we are not a homogeneous society. We are a nation of immigrants. Mm-hmm. And when we say, I'm an American, you could be any race as long as you are loyal to your country. But in countries like France and other European countries, the far right targets immigrants, and unless you share what is viewed as some type of common German or French ancestry tied by blood and kin, legally immigrating to a country, becoming a citizen, just seems not to be enough for the far right in Europe. And this is why we see a very different existence for American Muslims compared to our brothers and sisters in Europe, where they face ghettoization, where they face a lack of job opportunities, where they have restrictions on their ability to get education. And so, yes, the far right engages in an anti-immigrant policy where, being a citizen is not enough in these countries. You have to have some type of ethnic kinship and to be considered a citizen according to the far right in Europe. I think, in the long term, Europe is going to become like America, where, citizenship is defined by loyalty to one's country and not your genes. But the far right has a long way to catch up. In the meantime, it creates a very dangerous situation in Europe where minorities can be targeted not only by legal means like this, but also by violence. And so that's something that we have to be aware of and that we have to monitor and engage on.
Mr. Robert Macau, you are the organization's Director of Government Affairs Department. I recall the name of your organization, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Thank you so much for joining us on Radio Algeria International.
Thank you so much for having me.